The Plague by Albert Camus, translated by Stuart Gilbert. I will not be reading the preface. I will not be reading the introduction. Epigraph. It is as reasonable to represent one kind of imprisonment by another, as it is to represent anything that really exists by that which exists not. Daniel Defoe. The Plague, Part 1. The unusual events described in this chronicle occurred in 1940-something at Oran. Everyone agreed that, considering their somewhat extraordinary character, they were out of place there, for its ordinariness is what strikes one first about the town of Oran, which is merely a large French port on the Algerian coast, headquarters of the prefect of a French department. The town itself, let us admit, is ugly. It has a smug, placid air, and you need time to discover what it is that makes it different from so many business centers in other parts of the world. How to conjure up a picture, for instance, of a town without pigeons, without any trees or gardens, where you never hear the beat of wings or the rustle of leaves, a thoroughly negative place, in short. The seasons are discriminated only in the sky. All that tells you of the spring's coming is the feel of the air or the baskets of flowers brought in from the suburbs by peddlers. It's a spring cried in the marketplaces. During the summer the sun bakes the houses bone dry, sprinkles our walls with grayish dust, and you have no option but to survive those days of fire indoors, behind closed shutters. In autumn, on the other hand, we have deluges of mud. Only winter brings really pleasant weather. Perhaps the easiest way of making a town's acquaintance is to ascertain how people in it work, how they love, how they die. In our little town, is this, one wonders, an effect of the climate? All three are done in much the same lines, with the same feverish yet casual air. The truth is that everyone is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. Our citizens work hard, but solely with the object of getting rich. Their chief interest is in commerce, and their chief aim in life is, as they call it, doing business. Naturally, they don't eschew such simpler pleasures as love-making, sea-bathing, going to the pictures. But very sensibly, they reserve these pastimes for Saturday afternoons and Sundays, and employ the rest of the week in making money, as much as possible. In the evening, on leaving the office, they foregather, at an hour that never varies, in the cafes, stroll the same boulevard, or take the air on their balconies. The passions of the young are violent and short-lived. Vices of older men seldom range beyond an addiction to bowling, to banquets, and socials, or clubs where large sums change hands on the fall of a card. It will be said, no doubt, that these habits are not peculiar to our town. Really, all our contemporaries are much the same. Certainly, nothing is commoner nowadays than to see people working from morn till night, then proceeding to fritter away at card tables, in cafes, and in small talk, what time is left for living. Nevertheless, there still exist towns and countries where people have now and then an inkling of something different. In general, it doesn't change their lives. Still, they have had an intimation, and that's so much to the good. Oran, however, seems to be a town without intimations, in other words, completely modern. Hence I see no need to dwell on the manner of loving in our town. The men and women consume one another rapidly in what is called the act of love, or else settle down to a mild habit of conjugality. We seldom find a mean between these extremes. That, too, is not exceptional. At Oran, as elsewhere, for lack of time and thinking, people have to love one another without knowing much about it. What is more exceptional in our town is the difficulty one may experience there in dying. Difficulty, perhaps, is not the right word. Discomfort would come nearer. Being ill is never agreeable, but there are towns that stand by you, so to speak, when you are sick, in which you can, after a fashion, let yourself go. An invalid needs small attentions. He likes to have something to rely on, and that's natural enough. But at Oran, the violent extremes of temperature, the exigencies of business, the uninspiring surroundings, the sudden nightfalls, and the very nature of its pleasures call for good health. An invalid feels out of it here. Think what it must be for a dying man trapped behind hundreds of walls all sizzling with heat, while the whole population, sitting in cafes or hanging on the telephone, is discussing shipments, bills of lading, discounts! It will then be obvious what discomfort attends death. even modern death, when it waylays you under such conditions in a dry place. These somewhat haphazard observations may give a fair idea of what our town is like. However, we must not exaggerate. Really, all that was to be conveyed was the banality of the town's appearance and of life in it. But you can get through the days there without trouble once you have formed habits. And since habits are precisely what our town encourages, all is for the best. Viewed from this angle, its life is not particularly exciting, that must be admitted. But at least social unrest is quite unknown among us. Our frank-spoken, amiable, and industrious citizens have always inspired a reasonable esteem in visitors. Treeless, glamourless, soulless, the town of Oran ends by seeming restful, and after a while you go complacently to sleep there. It's only fair to add that Oran is grafted onto a unique landscape, in the center of a bare plateau, ringed with luminous hills, above a perfectly shaped bay. All we may regret is the town's being so disposed that it turns its back on the bay, with the result that it's impossible to see the sea. You always have to go look for it. Such being the normal life of Oran, it will be easily understood that our fellow citizens had not the faintest reason to apprehend the incidents that took place in the spring of that year in question, and were, as we subsequently realized, premonitory signs of the grave events we are to chronicle. To some, these events will seem quite natural, to others, all but incredible. But obviously a narrator cannot take account of these differences of outlook. His business is only to say, "This is what happened," when he knows that it actually did happen, that it closely affected the life of a whole populace, and that there are thousands of eyewitnesses who can appraise in their hearts the truth of what he writes. In any case, the narrator, whose identity will be made known in due course, would have little claim to competence for a task like this, had not the chance put him in the way of gathering much information, and had he not been by the force of things closely involved in all that he proposes to narrate. This is his justification for playing the part of a historian. Naturally, a historian, even an amateur, always has data, personal or at second hand, to guide him. The present narrator has three kinds of data. First, what he saw himself. Secondly, the accounts of other eyewitnesses, thanks to the part he played, and was enabled to learn their personal impressions from all these figuring in the chronicle. And lastly, documents that subsequently came into his hands. He proposes to draw on these records whenever this seems desirable, and to employ them as he thinks best. He also proposes, but perhaps the time has come to drop preliminaries and cautionary marks, and launch into the narrative proper. The account of the first days needs giving in some detail. When leaving his surgery on the morning of April 16th, Dr. Bernard Rieu felt something soft under his foot. It was a dead rat lying in the middle of the landing. On the spur of the moment he kicked it to one side, and without giving it a further thought continued on his way downstairs. Only when he was stepping out into the street did it occur to him that a dead rat had no business to be on his landing, and he turned back to ask the concierge of the building to see to its removal. It was not until he noticed old Monsieur Michel's reaction to the news that he realized the peculiar nature of his discovery. Personally, he had thought the presence of the dead rat rather odd, no more than that. The concierge, however, was genuinely outraged. On one point he was categorical. "There weren't no rats here." In vain the doctor assured him that there was a rat, presumably dead, on the second-floor landing. Monsieur Michel's conviction wasn't to be shaken. "There weren't no rats in the building," he repeated, "so someone must have brought this one from outside. Some youngster trying to be funny, most likely." That evening, when Dr. Rieu was standing in the entrance, feeling for the latchkey in his pocket before starting up the stairs to his apartment, he saw a big rat coming toward him from the dark end of the passage. It moved uncertainly, and its fur was sopping wet. The animal stopped and seemed to be trying to get its balance, moved forward again toward the doctor, halted again, then spun round on itself with a little squeal and fell on its side. Its mouth was slightly open, and blood spurting from it. After gazing at it for a moment, the doctor went upstairs. He wasn't thinking about the rat. That glimpse of spurting blood had switched his thoughts back to something that had been on his mind all day. His wife, who had been ill for a year now, was due to leave next day for a sanatorium in the mountains. He found her lying down in the bedroom, resting, as he had asked her to do, in view of the exhausting journey before her. She gave him a smile. Do you know, I'm feeling ever so much better, she said. The doctor gazed down at the face that turned toward him in the glow of the bedside lamp. His wife was 30, and the long illness had left its mark on her face. Yet the thought that came to Rio's mind as he gazed at her was, how young she looks, almost like a baby girl. But perhaps that was because of the smile which effaced all else. Now try to sleep, he counseled. The nurse is coming at 11, you know, and you have to catch the midday train. He kissed the slightly moist forehead. The smile escorted him to the door. Next day, April 17th, at 8 o'clock, the concierge buttonholed the doctor as he was going out. Some young scallywags, he said, had dumped 3 dead rats in the hall. They'd obviously been caught in traps with very strong springs, as they were bleeding profusely. The concierge had lingered in the doorway for quite a while, holding the rats by their legs and keeping a sharp eye on the passers-by, on the off chance that the miscreants would give themselves away by grinning or some facetious remark. His watch had been in vain. "But I'm all right," said Monsieur Michel hopefully. Much puzzled, Rio decided to begin his round in the outskirts of the town, where his poorest patients lived. The scavenging in these districts was done late in the morning, and as he drove his car along the straight, dusty streets, he cast glances at the garbage cans aligned along the edge of the sidewalk. In one street alone, the doctor counted as many as a dozen rats deposited on the vegetable and other refuse in the cans. He found his first patient, an asthma case of long standing, in a bed, in a room that served as both a dining room and bedroom and overlooked the street. The invalid was an old Spaniard with a hard, rugged face. Placed on the coverlet in front of him were 2 pots containing dried peas. When the doctor entered, the old man was sitting up, bending his neck back, gasping and wheezing in his efforts to recover his breath. His wife brought a bowl of water. "Well, doctor," he said, while the injection was being made, "they're coming out. Have you noticed?" "The rats, he means," his wife explained. "The man next door found 3. They're coming out. You can see them in all the trash cans. It's hunger." Ria soon discovered that the rats were the great topic of conversation in that part of town. After his round of visits, he drove home. "There's a telegram for you, sir, upstairs," Monsieur Michel informed him. The doctor asked him if he had seen any more rats. "No," the concierge replied. "There ain't been any more. I'm keeping a sharp lookout, you know. Those youngsters wouldn't dare when I'm around." The telegram informed Vieux that his mother would be arrived next day. She was going to keep house for her son during his wife's absence. When the doctor entered his apartment, he found the nurse already there. She looked at his wife. She was in a tailor-made suit, and he noticed that she had used rouge. He smiled to her. "That's splendid," he said. "You're looking very nice." A few minutes later, he was seeing her into the sleeping car. She glanced round the compartment. "It's too expensive for us, really, isn't it?" "It had to be done," Rio explained. "What's this story about the rats that's going round?" "I can't explain it. It certainly is queer, but it'll pass." Then hurriedly he begged her to forgive him. He felt he should have looked after her better. He'd been most remiss. When she shook her head as if to make him stop, he added, "Anyhow, once you're back, everything will be better. We'll make a fresh start." "That's it." Her eyes were sparkling. "Let's make a fresh start." Then she turned her head and seemed to be gazing through the car window at the people on the platform, jostling one another in their haste. The hissing of the locomotive reached their ears. Gently he called his wife's first name. When she looked round, he saw her face wet with tears. "Don't," he murmured. Behind the tears, the smile returned, a little tense. She drew a deep breath. "Now, off you go. Everything will be all right." He took her in his arms and stepped back on the platform. Now he could only see her smile through the window. "Please, dear," he said, "take great care of yourself." But she could not hear him. As he was leaving the platform near the exit, he met Monsieur Othon, the police magistrate, holding his small boy by the hand. The doctor asked him if he was going away. Tall and dark, Monsieur Othon had something in the air of what used to be called a man of the world, something of an undertaker's assistant. "No," the magistrate replied. "I've come to meet Madame Othon, who's been to present her respects to my family." The engine whistled. "Those rats now," the magistrate began. Ryu made a brief movement in the direction of the train, then turned back toward the exit. "The rats," he said. "It's nothing." The only impression of that moment which afterwards he could recall was the passing of a railroadman with a box full of dead rats under his arm. In the early afternoon of that day, when his consultations were beginning, a young man called on Ria. The doctor was gathering that he had called before in the morning and was a journalist by profession. His name was Raymond Rambert. Short, square-shouldered, with a determined-looking face and keen, intelligent eyes, he gave the impression of someone who could keep his end up in any circumstances. He wore sports type of clothes. He came straight to the point. His newspaper, one of the leading Paris dailies, had commissioned him to make a report on the living conditions prevailing among the Arab population, especially on the sanitary conditions. Rieux replied that these conditions were not good, but before he said any more he wanted to know if the journalist would be allowed to tell the truth. Certainly, Rambert replied. I mean, Rieux explained, would you be allowed to publish an unqualified condemnation of the present state of things? Unqualified? Well, no, I couldn't go that far, but surely things aren't quite so bad as that. No, Rieux said quietly, they weren't so bad as that. He had put the question solely to find out if Rambert could or couldn't state the facts without paltering with the truth. I have no use for statements in which something is kept back, he added. That is why I shall not furnish information in support of yours. The journalist smiled. Ah, you talk the language of Saint-Just. Without raising his voice, Rieux said he knew nothing about that. The language he used was that of a man who was sick and tired of the world he lived in, though he had much liking for his fellow men, and had resolved, for his part, to have no truck with injustice and compromises with the truth. His shoulders hunched, Rambert glanced at the doctor for some moments without speaking. Then, I think I understand you, he said, getting up from his chair. The doctor accompanied him to the door. It's good of you to take it like that, he said. Yes, yes, I understand, Rambert repeated, with what seemed a hint of impatience in his voice. Sorry to have troubled you. When shaking hands with him, Rieux suggested that if he was out for curious stories for his paper, he might say something about the extraordinary number of dead rats that were being found in the town just now. Ah, Rambert exclaimed, that certainly interests me. On his way out at 5 for another round of visits, the doctor passed on the stairway a stocky, youngish man with a big, deeply furrowed face and bushy eyebrows. He had met him once or twice on the top-floor apartment, and which was occupied by some male Spanish dancers. Puffing a cigarette, Jean Theroux was gazing down at the convulsions of a rat dying on the step in front of him. He looked up, and his gray eyes remained fixed on the doctor for some moments. Then, after wishing him a good day, he remarked that it was rather odd the way all these rats were coming out of their holes to die. Very odd, Rieux agreed, and it ends by getting on one's nerves. In a way, doctor, only in a way. We've not seen anything of the sort before, that's all. Personally, I find it interesting. Yes, definitely interesting. Theroux ran his fingers through his hair to brush it off his forehead, looked again at the rat, which had now stopped moving, then smiled toward Rieux. But really, doctor, it's the concierge's headache, isn't it? As it so happened, the concierge was the next person Rieux encountered. He was leaning against the wall beside the street door. He was looking tired, and his normally rubicund face had lost its color. Yes, I know, the old man told Rieux, who had informed him of the latest casualty among the rats. I keep finding him by twos and threes, but it's the same thing in the other houses in the street. He seemed depressed and worried, and was scratching his neck absent-mindedly. Rieux asked him how he felt. The concierge wouldn't go so far as to say he was feeling ill. Still, he wasn't quite up to the mark. In his opinion, it was just due to worry, though these damn rats had given him a shock like. It would be a relief when they stopped coming and dying all over the place. Next morning, it was April 18, when the doctor was bringing back his mother from the station, he found Monsieur Michel looking still more out of sorts. The stairway from the cellar to the attics was strewn with dead rats. 10 or a dozen of them. The garbage cans of all the houses in the street were full of rats. The doctor's mother took it quite calmly. It's like that sometimes, she said vaguely. She was a small woman with silver hair and dark, gentle eyes. I'm so glad to be with you again, Bernard, she added. The rats can't change that, anyhow. He nodded. It was a fact that everything seemed easy when she was there. However, he rang up the municipal office. He knew the man in charge of the department concerned with the extermination of vermin, and he asked him if he'd heard about all the rats that were coming out to die in the open. Yes, Monsieur Mercier knew all about it. In fact, 50 rats had been found in his offices, which were near the wharves. To tell the truth, he was rather perturbed. Did the doctor think it meant anything serious? Rieux couldn't give a definite opinion, but he thought the sanitary service should take action of some kind. Mercier agreed. And if you think it's really worth the trouble, I'll get an order issued as well. It certainly is worth the trouble, Rieux replied. His charwoman had just told him that several hundred dead rats had been collared in the big factory where her husband worked. It was about this time that our townsfolk began to show signs of uneasiness, for from April 18th onwards, quantities of dead or dying rats were found in factories and warehouses. In some cases the animals were killed to put an end to their agony. From the outer suburbs to the center of town, and all the byways where the doctor's duties took him, in every thoroughfare rats were piled up in garbage cans or lying in long lines in the gutters. The evening papers that day took up the matter and inquired whether or not the city fathers were going to take steps, and what emergency measures were contemplated to abate this particularly disgusting nuisance. Actually, the municipality had not contemplated doing anything at all, but now a meeting was convened to discuss the situation. An order was transmitted to the sanitary service to collect the dead rats at daybreak every morning. When the rats had been collected, 2 municipal trucks were to take them to be burned in the town incinerator. But the situation worsened in the following days. There were more and more dead vermin in the streets, and the collectors had bigger truckloads every morning. On the fourth day the rats began to come out and die in batches. From basements, cellars, and sewers they emerged in long, wavering lines into the light of day, swayed helplessly, then did a sort of pirouette and fell dead at the feet of the horrified onlookers. At night, in passages and alleys, their shrill little death cries could be clearly heard. In the mornings the bodies were found lining the gutters, each with a gout of blood like a red flower on its tapering muzzle. Some were bloated and already beginning to rot, others rigid with their whiskers still erect. Even in the busy heart of town you found them piled in little heaps on landings and in backyards. Some stole forth to die singly in the halls of public offices, in school playgrounds, and even on cafe terraces. Our townsfolk were amazed to find such busy centers as the Place d'Armes, the boulevards, and the promenade along the waterfront dotted with repulsive little corpses. After the daily clean-up of the town, which took place at sunrise, there was a brief respite. Then gradually the rats began to appear again in numbers that went on increasing throughout the day. People at night would often feel underfoot the squelchy roundness of a still warm body. It was as if the earth on which our houses stood were being purged of its secreted humors, thrusting up to the surface the abscesses and pus clots that had been forming in its entrails. You must picture the consternation of our little town, hitherto so tranquil, and now, out of the blue, shaken to its core, like a quite healthy man who all of a sudden feels his temperature shoot up and the blood seething like wildfire in his veins. Things went so far that the Ransdorf Information Bureau, inquires in all subjects promptly and accurately answered, which ran a free information talk on the radio by way of publicity, began its talk by announcing that no less than 6,231 rats had been collected and burned in a single day, April 25th. Giving as it did an ampler and more precise view of the scene daily enacted before our eyes, this amazing figure had administered a jolt to the public nerves. Hitherto people had merely grumbled at a rather stupid, obnoxious visitation. They now realized that this strange phenomena, whose scope could not be measured, and whose origins escaped detection, had something vaguely menacing about it. Only the old Spaniard whom Dr. Rieux was treating for asthma went on rubbing his hands and chuckling, "They're coming out, they're coming out," with senile glee. On April 28th, when the Ransdorf Bureau announced that 8,000 rats had been collected, a wave of something like panic swept the town. There was a demand for drastic measures. The authorities were accused of slackness, and people who had houses on the coast spoke of moving there, early in the year though it was. But next day the Bureau informed them that the phenomenon had abruptly ended, and the sanitary service had collected only a trifling number of rats. Everyone breathed more freely. It was, however, on this same day, at noon, that Dr. Rieux, when parking his car in front of the apartment house where he lived, noticed the concierge coming toward him from the end of the street. He was dragging himself along, his head bent, arms and legs curiously splayed out, with the jerky movements of a clockwork doll. The old man was leaning on the arm of a priest whom the doctor knew. It was Father Paneloux, a learned and militant Jesuit, whom he had met occasionally and who was very highly thought of in our town, even in circles quite indifferent to religion. Rieux waited for the two men to draw up to him. Monsieur Michel's eyes were fever bright and he was breathing wheezily. The old man explained that, feeling a bit off color, he had gone out to take the air, but he had started feeling pains in all sorts of places, in his neck, armpits, and groin, and had been obliged to turn back and ask Father Paneloux to give him an arm. "It's just swellings," he said. "I must restrain myself somehow." Leaning out of the window of the car, the doctor ran his hand over the base of Michel's neck. A hard lump, like a knot in wood, had formed there. Go to bed at once and take your temperature. I'll come to see you this afternoon." When the old man had gone, Ria asked Father Paneloux what he made of this queer business about the rats. "Oh, I suppose it's an epidemic they've been having." The father's eyes were smiling behind his big round glasses. After lunch, while Rieux was reading for the second time the telegram his wife had sent him from the sanatorium announcing her arrival, the phone rang. It was one of his former patients, a clerk in the municipal office, ringing him up. He had suffered for a long time from a constriction of the aorta, and as he was poor, Rieux charged no fee. "Thanks, doctor, for remembering me. But this time it's somebody else. The man next door has had an accident. Please come at once." He sounded out of breath. Ryu thought quickly. Yes, he could see the concierge afterwards. A few minutes later he was entering a small house in the Rue Federbe, on the outskirts of the town. Halfway up the drafty, foul-smelling stairs he saw Joseph Grand, the clerk, hurrying down to meet him. He was a man of about 50 years of age, tall and drooping, with narrow shoulders, thin limbs, and a yellowish mustache. "He looks better now," he told Ryu, "but I really thought his number was up." He blew his nose vigorously. On the top floor, the third, Ryu noticed something scrawled in red chalk on a door on the left. "Come in! I've hanged myself." They entered the room. A rope dangled from a hanging lamp above a chair lying on its side. The dining room table had been pushed into a corner, but the rope hung empty. "I got him down just in time." Grant seemed always to have trouble in finding his words, though he expressed himself in the simplest possible way. I was going out and I heard a noise, and when I saw that writing on the door I thought it was a prank. Only then I heard a funny sort of groan, and it made my blood run cold, as they say." He scratched his head. "That must be a painful way of doing it, I should think. Naturally, I went in." Grant had opened a door, and they were standing on a threshold of a bright but scantily furnished bedroom. There was a brass bedstead against one of the walls, and a plump little man was lying there, breathing heavily. He gazed at them with bloodshot eyes. Ria stopped short. In the intervals of the man's breathing he seemed to hear the little squeals of rats, but he couldn't see anything moving in the corners of the room. Then he went to the bedside. Evidently the man had not fallen from a sufficient height, or very suddenly, for the collarbone had held. Naturally, there was some asphyxia. An X-ray photograph would be needed. Meanwhile the doctor gave him a camphor injection and assured him he'd be all right in a few days. "Thanks, doctor," the man grumbled. When Rio asked Grand if he had notified the police, he hung his head. "Well, as a matter of fact, I haven't. The first thing I thought was to—" "Quite so," Rio cut in. "I'll see to it." But the invalid made a fretful gesture and sat up in bed. He felt much better, he explained. Really, it wasn't worth the trouble. "Don't feel alarmed," Rio said. "It's little more than a formality. Anyhow, I have to report this to the police." "Oh!" The man slumped back on his bed and started sobbing weakly. Grand, who had been twiddling his mustache while they were speaking, went up to the bed. "Come, Monsieur Cottard," he said. "Try to understand. People could say the doctor was to blame, if you took it into your head to have another shot at it." Cottard asked him tearfully that there wasn't the least risk of that he had had a sort of crazy fit, but it had passed, and all he wanted now was to be left in peace. Rieux was writing a prescription. "Very well," he said. "We'll say no more about it for the present. I'll come and see you again in a day or two, but don't do anything silly." On the landing he told Grand that he was obliged to make a report, but he would ask the police inspector to hold up the inquiry for a couple of days. "But somebody should watch Cottard tonight," he added. "Has he any relations?" "Not that I know of, but I can very well stay with him. I can't really say I know him, but one's got to help a neighbor, hasn't one?" As he walked down the stairs, Rio caught himself glancing into the darker corners, and he asked Grand if the rats had quite disappeared in his part of the town. Grand had no idea. True, he had heard some talk about rats, but he had never paid attention to gossip like that. "I've other things to think about," he added. Rio, who was in a hurry to get away, was already shaking his hand. There was a letter to write to his wife, and he wanted to see the concierge first. News vendors were shouting their latest news, that the rats had disappeared, but Ria found his patient leaning over the edge of the bed, one hand pressed firmly to his belly and the other to his neck, vomiting pinkish bile into a slop pail. After retching for some moments, the man lay back again, gasping. His temperature was 103. The ganglia of his neck and limbs were swollen. 2 black patches were developing on his thighs. He now complained of internal pains. "It's like fire," he whimpered. "The bastard's burning me inside." He could hardly get the words through his fever-crusted lips, and he gazed at the doctor with bulging eyes that his headache had suffused with tears. His wife cast an anxious look at Ria, who said nothing. Please, doctor, she said, what is it? It it might be almost anything. There's nothing definite as yet. Keep him on a light diet and give him plenty to drink. The sick man had been complaining of a raging thirst. On returning to his apartment, Ria rang up his colleague Richard, one of the leading practitioners in the town. No, Richard said, I can't say I've noticed anything exceptional. No cases of fever with local inflammation? Wait a bit. I have 2 cases with inflamed ganglia. Abnormally so? Well, Richard, that depends on what you mean by normal. Anyhow, that night the porter was running a temperature of 104, and in delirium was always babbling about "them rats." Rio tried a fixation abscess. When he felt the sting of the turpentine, the old man yelled, "The bastards!" The ganglia had become still larger and felt like lumps of solid fibrous matter embedded in the flesh. Madame Michel had completely broken down. Sit up with him, the doctor said, and call me if necessary. Next day, April 30th, the sky was blue and slightly misty. A warm, gentle breeze was blowing, bringing with it a smell of flowers from the outlying suburbs. The morning noises of the streets sounded louder, gayer than usual. For everyone in our little town this day brought the promise of a new lease of life, now that the shadows of fear under which they had been living for a week had lifted. Rio, too, was in an optimistic mood when he went down to see the concierge. He had been cheered up by a letter from his wife that had come with the first mail. Old Monsieur Michel's temperature had gone down to 99, and though he still looked very weak, he was smiling. "He's better, doctor, isn't he?" his wife inquired. "Well, it's a bit too early to say." At noon the sick man's temperature shot up abruptly to 104. He was in constant delirium and had started vomiting again. The ganglia in the neck were painful to the touch, and the old man seemed to be straining to hold his head as far as possible from his body. His wife sat at the foot of the bed, her hands on the counterpane, gently clasping his feet. She gazed at Rio imploringly. "Listen," he said. "We'll have to move him to a hospital and try a special treatment. I'll ring up for the ambulance." 2 hours later, the doctor and Madame Michel were in the ambulance, bending over the sick man. Rambling words were issuing from the gaping mouth, thickly coated now with swords. He kept on repeating, "Them rats! Them damn rats!" His face had gone livid, a grayish green. His lips were bloodless. His breath came in sudden gasps. His limbs spread out by the ganglia, embedded in the berth, as if he were trying to bury himself in it, or a voice from the depths of the earth were summoning him below. The unhappy man seemed to be stifling under some unseen pressure. His wife was sobbing. "Is there any hope left, doctor?" "He's dead," said Ria.